I'm the kind of person who tends to adapt pretty quickly to my situation. And moving to the Netherlands in January of 2024 was no exception to that rule. When I moved to the Netherlands, I want to say it took me about a month at most to feel at home. And home is a very fickle term, especially for someone like me who is obviously a digital nomad, a transient, if you will. But it's safe to say that being in the Netherlands feels very comfortable to me. And I feel like wherever you feel comfortable, that is your home. That said, before the Netherlands, the United States of America was my home for the entirety of my life leading up to that point. But after landing here in the US last night, I think around 23 hours ago, I'm not sure that the US is home for me anymore. So as you can see, I am walking around this neighborhood in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is where I grew up. And it's pretty interesting because when you grow up here, this is your normal. Just like when you grow up in the Netherlands, that is your normal. But after spending 14 months in the Netherlands, this no longer feels normal to me. Nothing about being here feels normal. And honestly, this is probably going to be a multi-part video series, because if I just sat here and explained all of the reverse culture shocks I've experienced just in these first 23 hours, this would turn into a podcast episode very, very quickly. That said, in this video, I want to cover some of the immediate culture shocks that I noticed actually before even arriving here in the US. The first of which being the prevalence of English. Now I know this is a pretty obvious one. Of course, in the Netherlands they speak Dutch, whereas in the US, English is the predominant language. However, if you are American and you don't know much about the Netherlands, people in the Netherlands speak and understand English very, very well. In fact, the only people that don't seem to speak and or understand English very well are the older generation. But even them, I mean, a lot of times they're watching my videos. So at least a good portion of that demographic understands English well enough to be able to watch my content. I think they're doing lawn work over there, so we're gonna walk back this way. But that said, it definitely kind of shocked me to hear so many people speaking English as we boarded our flight, our connecting flight from London to Dallas, because I hadn't really heard people speak English, particularly with an American accent, since I left. And listen, depending on what part of the Netherlands you go to, your experience with this may vary. Because if you're in Amsterdam, if you're in Rotterdam, if you're in one of the bigger cities, you're going to come across Americans. You're going to come across British people. You're going to come across people who speak different languages and have to resort to speaking English to be able to communicate with everyone around them. But in the places that I was in the Netherlands, in Brabant, in Gelderland, people didn't really speak English. They spoke and understood it, again, but there weren't any Americans there, is what I'm saying. And I think something that I sort of took for granted was the ability to tune out conversations. Because in the Netherlands, I could be in a crowded room and everyone around me could be talking. They could even be talking loudly. But I could still hear my own inner voice because I didn't know what most of them were saying. I could only pick up bits and pieces. And as my Dutch got a little bit better, of course, that started to change. I started to be able to pick up at least somewhat of the context of some of those conversations. But it was nothing like my experience being around a bunch of Americans for the first time in 14 months. That was very jarring. That was an absolutely jarring experience for me. And honestly, if I'm just gonna be real with you, it was a bit of a negative experience because, again, I can no longer hear my own inner dialogue. So I lost a bit of mental bandwidth because of it. But at the same time, it did feel a bit comforting. So just to offset the negative side of it, it did feel a bit comforting to be around people who I knew fundamentally understood me, because again, we come from the same country. Whereas people who are speaking a different language, there's a fundamental gap in understanding between us. And my goal, of course, is to shorten that gap as I go about traveling internationally, and to help you shorten that gap as well by documenting those travels. But I digress. The next thing that shocked me upon returning to the US was the outgoingness of people. Now, this might actually be a direct byproduct of me just being able to understand what people were saying. It's very possible that people in the Netherlands are, excuse me, every bit as outgoing as Americans. I just couldn't understand what they were saying. And actually, I will say that Dutch people were far more outgoing than I anticipated before I went there, because I was sort of under the impression, what is that? Some kind of lizard in that tree. Don't have those in the Netherlands, but anyways, before I went to the Netherlands, I was under the impression that Dutch people were kind of cold, reserved, introverted, things of that nature, kind of like me. But what I found is that Dutch people are very outgoing, but Americans, they are outgoing in the sense that they will interject into your conversation. And depending on how you perceive social dynamics, that could be a good or a bad thing. For me, it's kind of a neutral thing. So just to give you an example, as we were boarding the plane to go from London to DFW, because again, we had a connecting flight from London, I was telling my girlfriend that if they had Interstellar on the little movie selection thing on the plane, that we should watch it, because Interstellar is my favorite movie. If you know, you know. It's an absolutely amazing film. But as I was telling her this, somebody maybe a few feet ahead of us interjected in the conversation and said, yeah, I think they usually have Interstellar on American Airlines flights, and you guys should definitely watch it. It's an amazing film. And of course, this isn't a negative interaction, and it sort of did make me feel a bit comforted, I guess, for lack of a better term, because I guess bonding with people, even if just briefly, over common interests is always going to create a sense of comfort, just by default. Let's actually go this way. But at the same time, again, depending on your expectations regarding social dynamics, that could be a little bit jarring. And I did find it a little jarring because Dutch people don't really do stuff like that. Let me make sure I don't get hit by this car. Okay, they're turning. So Dutch people don't really do stuff like that, at least not very frequently. They might approach you, they might say hi, things like that, but I find it very rare that they will literally insert themselves into your conversation that you're having with someone else. Or something else that I noticed was that Americans like to network. Never really noticed this as much before, but as we were standing in that same line to board the plane, that same exact flight, I heard two people behind me begin talking on the basis of the college that they both attended. So I guess one of them maybe had a shirt or a bag or something that indicated that they attended Purdue University, which is a college in Indiana, I believe, United States of America. He said, oh, did you go to Purdue? And the guy was like, yeah. And he was like, well, when were you there? They found out that they were there around the same time. And then that conversation became the what do you do for a living conversation. And then I think the guy said that he owned a plumbing management or construction management, something like that, some sort of blue collar company, which is cool because of course I'm an entrepreneur myself. I always respect entrepreneurs, but I found it really fascinating just how easily they were able to strike up a conversation on the basis of the college that they went to. And maybe those conversations do happen in the Netherlands as well, but I just haven't really seen them. But again, I'm not fluent enough in Dutch to be able to eavesdrop on people. So it's very possible that people are having those conversations. But the whole "what do you do for a living" conversation, I feel like, actually, you know what, that is somewhat common in my experience. I have had a lot of people ask me what I do for a living, and then when I tell them YouTube, they always seem very shocked, and rightfully so. But I don't feel like it happens that early in the conversation. They were maybe 30 seconds into this conversation before that question came up. I don't even know if they told each other what their names were before they started talking about that. But again, I don't know if this is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. Definitely a different thing. Now, the next thing that I noticed, and I noticed this more so upon arriving to the US, was the size of everything. Now listen, I live in Texas. Well, I don't live in Texas, I live in the Netherlands, technically. But I grew up in Texas. And something that Texas is known for is size. In fact, one of the state slogans is "everything is bigger in Texas." And the way that that airport, DFW International Airport, is set up, you can actually see the parking garage from inside of the airport. And so as we were walking through the departure area, or arrivals area, the part of the airport where you get your bags and then you leave, I was looking in the parking garage and I realized that literally 70 to 80% of the cars, no exaggeration, 70 to 80% of the vehicles in there were either trucks or SUVs. And that is a stark contrast to what you see in the Netherlands, where everyone is driving those smaller cars. 70 to 80% of the cars out there are going to be smaller cars. Honda Fits, Toyota Aigos, Toyota Yaris's, cars like that. Maybe Volkswagen Polos, things of that nature. Here, I would say that right there, a Honda Accord, is a very typical car. And again, there are more and more people who are opting for trucks and SUVs, especially here in Texas. But aside from the cars, I noticed that the people were bigger. And you probably think you know where I'm going with this, but actually it's not what you think. You see, one thing that you may or may not know about me is that I'm a gym rat. I love the gym. I go to the gym 6 days a week. I will move mountains to make sure I can get my workout in on any given day. So my reticular activating system is set up to where when somebody is abnormally muscular, I can spot them very quickly. In the Netherlands, I feel like more often than not, and it's gonna sound like I'm bragging, but I'm literally just making an objective observation. More often than not, I'm one of the most muscular people just about anywhere I go in the Netherlands. And of course, a lot of this just has to do with people out there not being interested in bodybuilding or anything like that. But I digress. I feel like a lot of times I'm one of the bigger people out there wherever I go, whereas in the US, I was instantly humbled. I mean, I saw probably 3 or 4 people who just dwarfed me. Are they on steroids? Are they natural? I don't know. I know I'm natural, and I try to kind of assume that everyone else is natural until proven otherwise. But I was humbled. I was definitely humbled because some of these people, man, they were just jacked. And of course, you had your fair share of just generally overweight people as well. And proportionally speaking, there were a lot more of those people than you would see in the Netherlands for sure. But just size in general, people here tend to be bigger for better or for worse. Cars tend to be bigger for better or for worse. more often than not for worse. Houses tend to be bigger. This isn't really the most affluent neighborhood. This is, again, a relatively typical middle class suburb in DFW. And you see houses like this. Don't want to record people's houses too much. Don't want to invade anyone's privacy. But you can see the house on the corner over there is pretty large. You had a truck just pass by. Again, a lot of trucks out here. Things are just bigger. The roads are bigger. Okay, this is a typical neighborhood street. It's a lot bigger than what you'd see in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, I feel like in neighborhoods, a lot of times it would be half this. So if you can see that little line in the middle of the road, that would be the whole entire road in a Dutch neighborhood. But you can see this house right here is pretty big. People, things, places, all of it is just bigger here. And of course, again, I live in Texas, which is literally known for having big things because it's a big state. But even in knowing that, just the sheer scale of everything blew my mind. I knew it was coming. I knew that was going to be something that shocked me, but I was utterly unprepared for it. Now, the next thing that blew my mind when I returned to the US, and this is something that I feel like people don't really think about or talk about that much, but I noticed this when I was walking through the airport in the US, the DFW airport, was the garbage system is different. And what do I mean by the garbage system? Well, essentially, in the Netherlands, and I think in most of Western Europe, everywhere I've been to in Western Europe, this has been the case. But in the Netherlands, they are very diligent about organizing their trash properly. So you have a container that's just for waste. You have a container that's just for plastic, a container that's just for paper and cardboard, a container that's just for glass. And you don't mix them. You do not mix any of that stuff. I don't know if maybe you get fined or something like that, but you just don't do it. Here, you have trash and recycling. That's it. Trash and recycling. Recycling is paper, plastic, cardboard, maybe glass, not entirely sure. But you have two options, and that is literally it. And of course, I'm sure that this has a negative impact on the environment overall. Or maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. But I imagine that if it wasn't worth the extra effort, the Netherlands or other European countries wouldn't be doing it. So I have to imagine that that's an area where the US definitely needs to pick up its game. You can see a little American sort of half cul-de-sac right here. You don't really see this in the Netherlands either. And definitely let me know if you want me to make a video just walking around American neighborhoods like this so that I can show you some of the differences and just really talk to you about how different being in an American neighborhood is than being in a Dutch neighborhood. But anyways, something else that I noticed upon arriving to the US after being in the Netherlands for 14 months is the lack of cyclists. So I actually just filmed a video earlier today where I showcased myself cycling to the grocery store, which in the Netherlands is a very typical thing that you just do. Here, that is not something that people do. And I was very quickly reminded of that when I almost got hit by a car coming back from the grocery store. And actually I had the right of way. We had the pedestrian walk sign. And the person had the nerve to get mad at me for going across the street when we had the right of way. But anyways, really, if you think about it, throughout this whole video, you probably haven't seen any pedestrians either. You've maybe seen a total of 2 people in the background. And look, yes, it is true, I'm an introvert. I have a little bit of social anxiety, so I try to avoid areas that have a lot of people. I haven't really been doing that in this video. I've just been walking around, and I mean, you see that there aren't many people out and about. You haven't seen anybody cycling, nobody riding their bikes. You've seen maybe a few cars pass by. People here are not really out and about like that, but especially when it comes to cycling, the culture is literally non-existent. It's all recreational. Cycling here is a recreational activity, nothing more than that. It's not something that people do as a form of transportation. And again, after cycling to the grocery store myself, I see why. I see why people here don't really see it as a viable form of transportation. And you could argue that it's because the infrastructure here isn't set up that way. But honestly, I don't think induced demand would really do much to fix that issue, to alleviate the discrepancy in biking culture between the Netherlands and the US. And the reason why is because I don't think it's about the infrastructure per se. I think the infrastructure follows the overall collective perspective about cycling. And what I mean by that is, listen, cycling here is seen as a pretty low status thing. It's either very high status or very low status, meaning that the people who cycle recreationally here are typically well off, because you have to be well off to be able to get a $10,000 bike, $5,000 bike. But the people who don't have bikes like that, who just use bikes for actual transportation, they are seen a little bit differently here. They're seen as lower status. That's the kind of thing that if a girl knew that you primarily rely on your bike to get from point A to point B, even though you know it saves literal hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars, if she knew that, she would probably lose interest in you. And it's wrong, it's messed up, but it's true. That's just the way that it is here. And I think that until people get over those limiting beliefs regarding cycling, just from a social status standpoint, the infrastructure is never going to happen, because there's no reason to put the infrastructure there if nobody's going to use it. So I think that's a very, very big issue that cannot just be alleviated by changing the structure of the place. You can't just change the bones of the place, you have to change the heart. You have to change the brain. And that takes time. Hopefully, I can help elicit some of that change. I can help accelerate some of that change within my lifetime by showcasing my experiences as an American in these other places, including, but not limited to, the Netherlands. Or maybe not. I don't know. All I know is that I am definitely not very comfortable here in the US. This feels like a foreign country to me, which is something that I never thought I would say. And hey, I'm gonna be here for 3 months, so maybe throughout these 3 months, it will feel like home to me again. But I'll never be able to look at it the same way because of what I've experienced from living in Europe.